Let me continue talking about the Center for Inquiry for a second, because, like I just said a bit ago, the Center for Inquiry is one of the largest, oldest secular humanist organizations in the country. Quick personal story: when I was graduating from college, I was expecting to go to grad school, but I have a summer where I'm not doing anything. And I got a chance to do an internship with the Center for Inquiry. And I'm like, that actually sounds kind of neat. Why does it sound neat? Because I read a lot of the stuff they put out. For those of you who are old, like me, and I'm thinking like 40 or older, we grew up in an age where the internet was relatively new, where if you wanted to learn about atheism, there were not a lot of books written for a lay audience. And I've heard this from a lot of people. The way they discovered atheism, skepticism, is because maybe they went to the library or they went to a bookstore and they saw this magazine on the shelves, Free Inquiry, or maybe Skeptical Inquirer. And they opened up these magazines and started reading them, and they were like, oh my God, this article about secular humanism, or this article questioning pseudoscience, like, it makes sense. This rational thinking, I could get behind this. And that's how they discovered atheism. That's how they discovered secular humanism. And obviously, bookstores kind of gone by and large. Those magazines aren't really in bookstores anymore. They might be. I'm not sure. I haven't seen them in a long time. But those magazines still get published. I don't know how far reaching they are, though, because as someone who covers news regarding church, state, pseudoscience, all that stuff, it's it's been years since I've seen a mainstream news article cite Free Inquiry or Skeptical Inquirer in anything else. Like, I don't think the articles in those magazines reach beyond their subscriber base. And who are the subscribers to those magazines? A lot of really old people, maybe people who gave money to the group a long time ago and totally forgot that like they gave that money. I don't know how many people read the magazine. It's just not that influential anymore, but the magazine still exists. I will say Skeptical Inquirer, I don't really care for articles about like Bigfoot and UFOs anymore, just not that relevant to me. So I don't really read Skeptical Inquirer, but Free Inquiry is still kind of a journal of sorts for thoughts about humanism. Okay, so the Center for Inquiry years ago merged with the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Science and Reason. So these two are in bed together, they work together. And their new CEO, by the way, this is the organization founded by a guy named Paul Kurtz, who was around for decades, one of the founding fathers, if you will, of secular humanism. He passed many, many years ago. And the CEO of the organization now is a woman named Robyn Blumner. And so in Free Inquiry, which I think is published 6 times a year, she always has an editorial essay in the magazine. And again, like I said, most of the time these never cross my path, because why would it? And no one's talking about it. But I was sent an article, the editorial she wrote for the latest issue of Free Inquiry, and it was so mind-bogglingly bad that I have to talk about it with you. And I would love to share you screenshots of it, but guess what? Not only is it not available in most bookstores and everywhere, because where are you going to find magazines in a bookstore these days? But it's also hidden behind a paywall. So only subscribers can read it and no one else can read it. So that's not ideal if you're looking to spread ideas about secular humanism. But here's the gist of her article. Like, let me give her the steel man argument of what she's saying. She said, and mind you, you could write an editorial about anything you want. And she's saying, you know what I want to talk about? Racism. She's a white woman. She wants to talk about racism. And her argument is, if we want to move past racism, we need to stop being racist. We need to stop seeing race. We need to move toward a color-blind society. And if you ever watched the Colbert Report back when Stephen Colbert was playing a character, like a right-wing character, occasionally he would have, let's say, an African-American author that he was interviewing, and he would always joke like, I've heard you're black. I don't know if you're black because I don't see color, but my staff tells me you're black. And that was kind of a running joke, because his whole thing is like, well, I don't see race. I'm beyond that. And of course, it's a joke because, of course, racism exists and you can't move past it until you acknowledge it. But I want to share excerpts of Blumner's article with you. And I'm also going to tell you that I wasn't sure I'm the right person to respond to this article. So I spoke with someone named Bakari Shabanu, who is a co-founder of Black Humanists and Nonbelievers of Sacramento. He actually wrote a lengthy article responding to what Robyn Blumner said. He's actually, if you're on YouTube right now, he is doing an interview with Mandisa Thomas of Black Nonbelievers, and their show is called In the Cut. And you can watch their interview where I believe they're talking about his article as well. So those are links for you right there. But I'm going to get to what Bakari wrote and what she said in her piece, okay? Because the whole premise that we just got to find a colorblind society, that's our goal, it's misguided. Because living in a colorblind society and ignoring race means you're ignoring some unique experiences that people have and the struggles that they face under the guise of racial equality. Like, you can't just pretend systemic racism doesn't affect us by ignoring race. So, let me share with you one passage from her piece here. And here is the editorial. This is a scanned copy, but you could see there's the editorial from Robyn Blumner, Secular Humanism and the Colorblind Society. And I'm going to scroll down to this passage right here. Well, let me see if I can. Color blindness used to be the aspiration of nearly everyone who supported the civil rights movement. It stood in stark contrast to the Black Panther and Nation of Islam approach to Black empowerment that was more segregationist, Black supremacist, and anti-white. See, Martin Luther King and all those guys, they used to push for color blindness. That was their goal. And as Bakari wrote in his response, like, you're totally missing the historical context of those organizations and of those movements because they emerged not to ignore race, but as a response to segregation and white violence and lynching and police brutality and systemic disenfranchisement of Black people. By the way, the Black Panther Party does not espouse Black supremacy. And while the Nation of Islam has preached something like that, their policies have never marginalized white people. So to ignore the historical context for Black resistance to white racism, Bakari writes, like, is ridiculous. You cannot move past racism if you're not acknowledging the historical harm done to Black people and the violence against Black people and the marginalization of Black people. Um, and the two groups that she brought up, uh, Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam, what did they emphasize? Black empowerment, pride in your culture, defense against systemic racism. Like, none of that stuff has ever been anti-white. It's never been about marginalizing white people. It's not reverse racism, right? But she's saying, as a humanist, the biggest obstacle to a colorblind society and racial harmony is apparently what these groups want is Black supremacy and a new kind of racism that's anti-white. None of that is true. None of that makes any sense, okay? Um, and then she goes on to say, actually, let me just say, like, what are the goals of the civil rights movement? It wasn't to ignore race. It was to end racial segregation while creating opportunities for marginalized groups to get education, housing, employment, political power, wealth. And you can only do that if marginalized groups have access to these sort of resources that can help them out. And maybe one solution to that is reparations. It's not the only solution, but this is the context in which it comes up. But Robyn Blumner writes that whatever racism existed in the past just doesn't exist anymore. And this is such a wild passage right here. Look at this. Most white people in the United States these days are not racist. Pause for a second. She capitalizes white, which is a choice, which is a very weird, weird choice. Most white people in the US today these days are not racist, I say these days in 2024. You can point backward to a different reality. There are still racists, of course, but in general, we have excised that demon as we have sloughed off other old prejudices, such as that women shouldn't work outside the home or that LGBTQ people shouldn't legally marry each other. See, guys, we got no one is anti woman anymore, no one's anti LGBTQ, and no one's racist. Not really. Then she says, we have made stunning progress, shifting all those attitudes within my lifetime. A cause for unbridled celebration, especially among humanists, many of whom were at the forefront of these civil rights struggles. First, let's back up to how's this? That women shouldn't work outside the home. This is literally a discussion about things JD Vance has been saying this week. We are not past that because there are people who want to take us back to women working inside the homes, bearing children, and having no other options if they don't want those. And this idea that, we're good on LGBTQ issues these days, that's not true. Obergefell could very well be overturned. Trans people have to fight for their own existence. And oh my God, Robyn Blumner, you work with Richard Dawkins, who is one of the most anti-trans voices across the globe. What the hell are you talking? See, we moved past that by and large. You're part of the problem. So, did you know that most white people these days are not racist? This is news to me. I don't know what she's citing. There's no footnote attached to that. It's just the way it is, which again, I'm not black. I can't necessarily speak to this. The racism I experience is very different from the racism black people experience. But I'm guessing there's a lot of racism out there, and a lot of it comes from white people. Sorry, it happens. That's the way it is. And look, even if most white people are not racist, racism permeates the actions of many of the most powerful white people in the country. Just look at the Republican Party. Look at what they talk about. Look at the policies they promote. Who is pushing against teaching people critical race theory? Those are conservatives who don't want people learning about our nation's history of slavery. Who's using woke as a dog whistle against black people and other marginalized groups, right? Like those people are out there in spades. So for all the progress that has been made, and yeah, there has been progress made, the obstacles tend to be created by the same sort of people who perpetuate racism, right? That is not necessarily individual prejudice. It is not some dude wearing a white cone hat. It's systemic. And that's why addressing the problem of racism requires understanding racism and then dismantling the structure that props up racism. And the one person who has maybe been most famous at trying to do that is a man named Ibram Kendi. And of course, Robyn Blumner has something to say about Ibram X. Kendi. Okay, let me show you this passage right here where we get introduced to a new term. For the identitarian left, the liberals who play identity politics, for the identitarian left, this is truly a Humpty Dumpty moment when words mean what they say they mean. I don't know what any of that means. If you are not racially discriminatory toward white people, according to Ibram X. Kendi, a godparent of the identitarian left, you are racist. And then she quotes Kendi saying, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination, Kendi wrote in words that would be softened in a future edition after they became the subject of criticism. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. In other words, two wrongs do make a right. Listen, we can put this in context because it's not that hard to do. What Kendi is basically saying is that if you want to address racist discrimination in the past, you cannot just pretend it doesn't exist. If you could wave a wand and just end racism today, it would not make up for the legacy of racism and slavery in our past. I think that's pretty obvious, right? Even if racism was gone, think about the inequality in all sorts of ways that has been built up over time because of how racist our society has been. If you want to go down a rabbit hole that you've never gone down, look up redlining and see the legacy of that. You know what I mean? So, what Kendi was saying is if you want to remedy racist discrimination in the past, you have to do anti-racist discrimination, which is his poetic, in a way of arguing that you need proactively to pass measures to make up for all those losses. You can't just pretend racism is gone. You have to undo it. And again, I mentioned reparations. That's one possible solution. But at the same time, you got to favor marginalized groups. You need policies that give a leg up to people who have been historically pushed down, right? You can't rectify the wrongs of the past by just pretending they don't exist. That's what he was trying to say. But Robyn Blumner is saying, see, he wants discrimination against whites. That's not at all what he was saying. He's not pushing for like reverse racism. That's not true. But giving marginalized groups a leg up, that is a necessary step, Kendi says, to dismantling, racial and economic injustice. So think about this: unequal education gaps, discriminatory housing. This is what Bakari was writing. High incarceration rates, class oppression. You can't undo that by just pretending to live in a colorblind society. You need policies that help the people who have been victims of those things in the past. Okay, so one argument against all that Robyn Blumner points out is that, look, some Black people have become really successful. That's it. That is the extent of her argument. And this may be the most mind-boggling passage in an entire essay full of dumb shit. Okay? Wait for it. What do you think she's going to say? What do you think she's going to say? Okay. How to do that, address racial inequality, how to do that best and most effectively, however, is not to double down on the enfeebling notion that every Black person is a victim of a systemically racist society, and under those circumstances, their lot is to be oppressed and downtrodden, especially because reality says differently. All right, let's get to it. We have a current Black vice president. We have Kamala. Racism is over, you guys. You know what? We had a Black president once too. That cured racism. She says we have a Secretary of Defense, yes, Ambassador to the United Nations, Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and 2 U.S. Supreme Court justices. As these examples, and thousands like them demonstrate, in today's America, people can largely succeed irrespective of their race. Oh my God. She just cited Clarence Thomas as proof that if you're Black, you can still do anything. She cited the most famous white supremacist in the country as proof that Black people can do anything. Because, yeah, Clarence Thomas is the most powerful white supremacist in the country. And I know you've heard the word token before. Having a successful person or two from a marginalized group that makes it somehow doesn't mean everything is okay. Because when the door opens, as many of those tokens or successful minorities could tell you, if you've been able to break through the door, or if you've been able to get through the door, your job, your obligation, if you will, is to hold it open for everyone else behind you so that they can get in. Because it's a horrible person who, like Clarence Thomas, who shuts that door behind him, right? And she also points out, like, we have 2 Black Supreme Court justices. You know why we have a Black Supreme Court? You know why we have Ketanji Brown Jackson? Because Joe Biden said, if you elect me president, I will absolutely appoint a Black woman to the Supreme Court. Like, because no one else was going to just do that on their own. He made a promise to do it, and he kept that promise. Like, and she's great. But again, that doesn't mean every Black person just has it that easy. Not that her journey was easy, you know what I mean? But like, having Black people or any marginalized group, having members of that group in a position of power doesn't mean racism is over. It doesn't. Ask anybody who knows what they're talking about. Okay. And then you go back to the actual systemic issues. Like, what about pay gaps and education gaps? And what about neighborhoods? Majority black neighborhoods look very different from majority white neighborhoods. You know what I mean? You could go down the line of how it's still harder to be a person of color in this society than it is to be a white person. Doesn't mean all white people have it easy either. But you get the idea. Like, you can't just say there's some successful black people, so I don't know why you all think racism exists. Just utterly stupid thinking here. What was the next dumb thing she said? Oh, she also brought up the Supreme Court decision from a very right wing Supreme Court last year that basically ended the practice of affirmative action at selective colleges. And here's what she says about that. Let me make sure. There we go. A Gallup poll from fall 2023 found that nearly 7 in 10 Americans, mostly white, thought the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling curtailing affirmative action in college admissions was mostly a good thing, including 52% of Black Americans. Why? Because to people of goodwill, admitting people to elite universities based largely on one's race puts an unfortunate asterisk on the academic careers of those admitted through an unfair process. It harms the very people it purports to help. She makes it sound like when affirmative action existed, Harvard would look at your application and say, oh, this person is black? Well, I guess that does it. Just let them in. That's not at all how it worked. Like, listen, I don't have much love for like Ivy League institutions necessarily, and not just because they rejected me, but how do those groups, how do those colleges work? They say, we do want to bring in a diverse group of Americans because that's good for the entire campus. So what can we do? Well, we could take race into account, and they did, and that's what the Supreme Court said they can't do. But there's a lot of other things they could do. They could just say, we're not going to weigh test scores as heavily. We will look at your zip code because that tells us a lot about how much money was in your neighborhood and the opportunities you had. We could look at what you did with your time, your family, how much money you make. Like, you could take all that stuff into account and get a holistic sense of where this student is coming from. Because as Bakari mentioned in his piece, if you are a Black person who you may be a really strong student, capable of doing so much more, but if you come from a neighborhood where the ceiling was relatively low, it may not look that great on paper. So with affirmative action and by taking race into account, you're saying, you know, you haven't had the opportunities, but man, do you have potential. And we're seeing that holistically looking at your application. Let's bring you in. So this idea that elite colleges, as she was saying, that it'll put an asterisk next to your name. No, it won't, because these people weren't getting admitted just because they were Black. Like, they got in on merit. They're not getting in there because they're Black and stupid, because they wouldn't survive at a school like that. No one would. They're getting in because they haven't necessarily had the opportunities of other students, and yet they thrived regardless. And these schools might say, let's give this kid a chance. And that's what you want to see from an elite institution. But then I looked at the study she mentioned there, the Gallup poll that said, you know, most Americans were fine with the Supreme Court's ruling, including 52% of Black Americans. Well, guess what happens when I look at the poll that here she is. Here is the Black adults, 52% of them say the Supreme Court's decision was a mostly good thing. But guess what? If you scroll down here, I'm going to get rid of this banner at the bottom. If you scroll down, look at this. What impact do you think the Supreme Court's decision will have on higher education in the U.S.? And if you look at Black adults in the blue, right over there, you know where I'm pointing, right over there. Look at this. Only 33% of Black adults say it'll be good, mostly slightly positive impact. 50% say, oh, this is going to be bad. Like, they know. And then look down here. As a result of this decision, do you think it'll be easier or harder for applicants of your race or ethnicity to attend college? 52% of Black adults say, yeah, much harder, slightly harder. Like, they're not thrilled about it. But think about what they would ask. The poll might say, do you agree with the Supreme Court's decision to get rid of affirmative action? If you don't know the nuance of everything I just told you, it's really tempting to say, well, yes, I don't think affirmative action is a good thing. I think everyone should be judged on merit. And so we don't need affirmative action. Like, that sounds pretty damn good when you don't understand how these schools are admitting students, when you don't understand why race might be taken into account. So it's not surprising that even a majority, slight majority of Black adults say it's a good thing. Because when you dig into, is it going to help you get into college? No. Is it good for your future? Not really. Like, they know. They know. God, this essay is so bad. Okay, I got, was there, here's another section from her. Let me show you this. I found this too. This is from the Pew Research Center. This was not related to the Supreme Court's decision, but they just said the question is the percentage of people who believe selective colleges and universities taking race and ethnicity into account in admissions decisions in order to increase the racial and ethnic diversity at the school. Who supports that? Who approves or disapproves of it? And look at Black Americans here. Right over here. Black Americans, 47% said, yeah, take my race into account. It's a good thing. 29% say don't. So you have a much larger group of Black Americans saying, I'm fine with affirmative action when you phrase it like this. And right above my head here, you could see 24% of them weren't sure. Fine. But like, it depends on what you're looking at, how you're asking the question. Here was another section of her Robyn Blumner's essay. She cites a book by, I think, a Black conservative named Coleman Hughes. And she says, Coleman Hughes makes a compelling case for a far more empowering, motivating, and fair approach to how race should be viewed in social policy in his important new book, The End of Race Politics: Arguments for a Colorblind Society. His thesis is that aspiring to a colorblind society where race is made as irrelevant as possible is not only good for societal peace and cohesiveness, but it is demonstrably good for Black Americans. It is far better than the identitarian left's prescription of exhaustively injecting race consciousness into every crevice of our lives. You guys, noticing race is so hard for this white woman writing the piece. You're trying to make me be conscious of race? How could you? It's so exhausting for her. You know what? Racism is really exhausting for victims of racism. I don't know. Maybe think about that. She also pointed this out in the same section. One interesting poll Hughes cites in a 2013 Gallup survey asking Blacks in the US the following question: on the average, Blacks have worse jobs, income, and housing than whites. Do you think this is mostly due to discrimination against Blacks, or is it mostly due to something else? Fully 60% of Blacks answered something else, meaning a solid majority did not think racism was the primary cause of disparities in life outcomes. Contrary to the identitarian left's insistence, it's not fetch. Stop trying to make fetch a thing. Stop saying that. Okay, anyway, this idea that, like, why do you think Black people have worse jobs, income, and housing? And this survey says your choices are discrimination or something else. Listen, I don't know what poll she's referring to, but you can make the argument that what is racism? For some people, if you're not wearing a white hood, it's not racism, right? If you're not actively saying, I'm doing this because I don't like Black people, it's not racism. But again, the history of racism in the United States is not just singling out Black people or people of color because it's overt. It's that overt. It's doing it in other ways. It's saying, you know what? We're not going to let you rent houses in this area. We're not going to let you get a bank loan in this part of the city. Like, is that discriminatory against race? Maybe not on the surface, but that's certainly the impact of it. So this idea that 60% said something else may include racism but not with people in white hoods. You know what I mean? Racism permeates all these aspects of society. So to pretend otherwise, as Robyn Blumner does, is ridiculous. There was one more section I wanted to show you. This is toward the end of the piece, I think. Yeah, here's this last section, kind of summarizing her whole point. It's underlined here. You don't bring a diversity of people together by dividing them by skin color or making skin color an essential qualification or disqualification for life's rewards. You bring them together by making racial distinctions as irrelevant as humanly possible, which is what color blindness means. It does not mean we are blind to skin color. It means we do our best to treat people equally without regard to it. And that sounds very nice, but that's not how anything works. And by the way, since when do we reward people just because of their skin color? How warped does your brain have to be to think, oh, that person only got the job because they're black? Like, what? You don't think they also have skills to bring to the table? I'm so done with this person. Ignoring racism, as she wants to do, is not going to fix racism. Adopting colorblindness sounds nice, but it doesn't fix our history, the traditions of the United States that were bad traditions and we need to address. As Bakari wrote in his essay, we have to acknowledge intersectionality, which values diverse experiences and fosters empathy and understanding. And when we acknowledge what our past was like and we work to fix that, sometimes taking proactive measures to make it easier for people who have been hurt in the past, that is the way we get to a level of equity. That's the way we get to an equal playing field. And you would think a spokesperson, the president of an organization promoting secular humanism, would know that better than anybody, because you have facts at the table, you have people who respect history and science and hopefully understands the pitfalls of both of those. You would think they would want to celebrate diversity and advocate for social justice, economic justice, educational justice, political justice. And what's Robyn Blumner's thesis here? Let's just ignore it all. Just forget it. If you say the word black, you're wrong. Like, just pretend it doesn't exist. It's such a thoughtless piece. And I know most people are not going to see this, unfortunately, but this is what the Center for Inquiry is promoting. You can't even pretend this is Richard Dawkins acting on his own and he has a tangential connection to this organization. This is the president of the organization speaking on its behalf. This is an editorial under her name in her magazine. Like, this is what the group represents. By the way, if you look up Center for Inquiry's board of directors, not a single woman on the list. It's the only atheist humanist organization I know that somehow doesn't have one woman on the board of directors. And apparently no black people editing the pieces in the magazine, clearly. What the hell is wrong with these people? It's so frustrating. Okay, again, I encourage you, if not to read Robyn's piece, go check out Bakari's piece. The link will be in the show notes underneath this clip. I'm done with this